On April 19, 2018, a prison in Alabama prepared for an event that would draw national attention, not for the crime alone, but for the age of the man about to face the state's final penalty. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., convicted murderer, legal schemer, and the oldest person executed in the United States since 1977, was about to meet his fate after more than 30 years of courtroom battles, appeals, and headlines that stretched far beyond Alabama's borders. But how did a man in his 80s end up in a place so few expected to see? What crimes set off a nationwide manhunt, left a federal judge dead, and forced the legal system to grapple with the question of age and capital punishment? Tonight, we break down the chilling timeline, the details buried in hundreds of legal filings, the devastating impact on families and the justice system, and the final hours of Walter Moody's life, without sensationalism and always with respect for the gravity of what took place. Let's walk through the facts, the trials, the aftermath, and the questions that linger even as the story draws to a close. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was born in 1935, a product of the Deep South during the Depression, where hard times were a given and expectations for the future were simple. Work hard, keep your head down, stay out of trouble. But Moody's path would be anything but ordinary. He was bright, ambitious, and fiercely determined, a man who dreamed of a career in law and medicine, but whose personal life was marked by resentment, failure, and over time a growing obsession with the system he believed had wronged him. Growing up in rural Alabama, Moody displayed an early aptitude for academics that set him apart from his peers. Teachers remembered him as exceptionally intelligent, but also as someone who couldn't accept being wrong. Even as a child, he exhibited the kind of rigid thinking that would later define his adult life. When challenged or corrected, Moody would become sullen and withdrawn, nursing grievances that others might have forgotten within hours. His family background was unremarkable by Depression-era standards. His father worked various jobs to keep the family afloat, and his mother tried to instill in Walter the values of hard work and perseverance. But somewhere along the way, those lessons twisted into something darker. Perseverance became an obsession. The ability to remember details became an inability to forget slights. His intelligence, which should have been his greatest asset, became the tool he used to justify his growing resentment against the world. After high school, Moody attempted to pursue higher education, but his academic dreams were repeatedly frustrated. He tried pre-law, then pre-med, but couldn't maintain the focus or the relationships necessary to succeed in either field. Professors and classmates found him difficult to work with, overly argumentative, and prone to conspiracy theories about why he wasn't achieving the success he believed he deserved. Moody's troubles with the law didn't begin with murder. In the late 1970s, he was convicted on federal charges for possessing a bomb that exploded in his home, injuring his then-wife. The circumstances surrounding that incident were telling. Moody had been experimenting with explosives, claiming he was conducting research for a book he was writing about terrorism. When the device detonated prematurely, seriously injuring his wife, Moody's explanation was that he was the victim of a government conspiracy designed to frame him. The conviction that followed would become the cornerstone of Moody's worldview. He blamed the justice system for his conviction, convinced that the courts had railroaded him. Friends and family would later describe him as a man consumed by his own sense of injustice, quick to anger, methodical in his grudges, never one to let a slight go unanswered. He spent hours in law libraries, filing motion after motion, appeal after appeal, becoming what legal professionals call a vexatious litigant, someone who uses the court system not to seek justice, but to harass and intimidate. But nobody could have predicted how far he would go or how many lives would be shattered along the way. It was December 16, 1989, when a fatal package arrived at the home of federal Judge Robert S. Vance in Birmingham, Alabama. What looked like a standard brown box concealed a deadly homemade bomb. When Judge Vance opened it, the blast was immediate and merciless. He was killed instantly, and his wife, Helen, was seriously wounded. The package had been carefully crafted to appear routine, the kind of legal document or correspondence that judges receive regularly. But inside, Moody had constructed a sophisticated explosive device using materials that were difficult to trace but devastatingly effective. The bomb was designed not just to kill, but to send a message to the entire federal judiciary. No one was safe. Judge Vance, a respected jurist who had served on the federal bench for over a decade, was known for his fairness and dedication to the law. He had presided over numerous high-profile cases, including civil rights matters and organized crime prosecutions. His murder wasn't random. It was a calculated strike at the heart of the justice system itself. The murder of a sitting federal judge was almost unprecedented in modern American history. The news ricocheted across the country. Within hours, federal agents, bomb technicians, and local law enforcement were working together, racing against time. This was no isolated act. Just 2 days later, a similar device killed civil rights attorney Robert E. Robinson in Savannah, Georgia. Robinson, a prominent civil rights lawyer, had dedicated his career to fighting discrimination and ensuring equal justice under the law. His law practice had taken on cases that others wouldn't touch, representing those who couldn't afford high-priced legal representation. Like Judge Vance, Robinson was targeted not for anything he had done to Moody personally, but for what he represented, the rule of law and equal justice. Soon, the connections grew clearer. 2 more bombs, one at the 11th Circuit Court in Atlanta and another at the Jacksonville office of the NAACP, were intercepted before they could kill again. Each package bore similarities: homemade components, carefully disguised and chillingly precise in their intent. The would-be bombs at the courthouse and NAACP office were discovered by alert security personnel who noticed suspicious characteristics in the packages: irregular weight distribution, unusual return addresses, and other telltale signs that something wasn't right. It became obvious. This was the work of someone who knew how to build, how to plan, and, most disturbingly, how to hate. The targeting wasn't random. It was strategic. Moody had chosen his victims to maximize terror within the legal community, while sending a clear message about his contempt for civil rights and federal authority. For weeks, fear spread through courthouses and law offices. Federal agents warned judges and prosecutors to be on alert. Security protocols were hastily implemented at federal buildings across the South. Mail rooms began screening packages more carefully, and many legal professionals started having their mail screened off-site before it reached their offices. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts of the decade, pouring resources into forensic analysis, handwriting comparisons, and the search for any lead that could break the case open. The investigation involved hundreds of agents and spanned multiple states as authorities worked to identify the bomber before he could strike again. It didn't take long before suspicion turned to Walter Leroy Moody Jr. Authorities found a trail of evidence that pointed directly to him. Materials used to construct the bombs matched those Moody had access to, and traces of his fingerprints surfaced in connection with various parcels. The investigation revealed Moody's methodical approach to his crimes. He had spent months, possibly years, planning his attacks. He researched his targets, studied their routines, and carefully selected the timing of his mailings to maximize impact. The bombs themselves showed sophisticated construction. They were designed to be lethal, but also to avoid detection during shipping. Investigators dug into Moody's past. They uncovered the earlier bombing conviction, the bitterness at the courts, and a long-standing grudge against the judicial system. Letters sent to newspapers and civil rights organizations were laced with legal jargon and language only a litigant with a personal stake would use. These letters, sent in the aftermath of the bombings, revealed Moody's twisted logic. He saw himself as a crusader against a corrupt system, justified in using violence to achieve his goals. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Moody's fingerprints were found on several components of the bombs, and handwriting analysis linked him to various pieces of correspondence connected to the attacks. More damning still, investigators discovered that Moody had purchased many of the materials used in the bomb construction, creating a paper trail that led directly to him. But it was the testimony of his second wife, Susan, that ultimately turned the case. She described Moody's erratic behavior, his secretive work in the garage, and even detailed how he had her address packages for him, parcels she would later realize were bombs. Susan's testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had lived with Moody intimately and witnessed his transformation from a bitter litigant into something far more dangerous. Susan described how Moody had become increasingly paranoid and violent in the months leading up to the bombings. He would spend hours in his workshop working on what he claimed were research projects. He had asked her to address packages using different handwriting styles, claiming it was for a legal strategy he was developing. Only after the bombings did she realize the true nature of what she had been asked to do. Federal prosecutors built a comprehensive case. Physical evidence, forensic science, and Susan Moody's testimony came together to form a picture of a man who was both calculating and obsessive, willing to wait years to exact what he believed was vengeance against those who had wronged him. Walter Moody's trial was one of the most closely watched in the South. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulative, vengeful man, driven by a singular mission to punish the justice system itself. The defense, meanwhile, pointed to circumstantial evidence and Moody's declining health, but the jury was not swayed. In 1991, Moody was convicted in federal court for the murder of Judge Vance and later tried and convicted in Alabama State Court for the same crime. The federal trial lasted several weeks and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including FBI agents, forensic experts, and Susan Moody. The prosecution methodically laid out their case, showing how Moody had planned and executed his attacks with meticulous precision. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Moody was being scapegoated for crimes he didn't commit. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The sentence: death. But the case was far from over. For more than a quarter century, Moody and his legal team mounted appeal after appeal, challenging everything from the evidence to the procedures, raising claims of improper jury instructions, constitutional violations, and even asserting that his advanced age and deteriorating health made execution cruel and unusual. Each argument was weighed, reviewed, and ultimately denied. Moody's appeals process became a case study in the complexities of the death penalty system. His lawyers argued that he had been denied effective counsel, that the evidence against him was insufficient, and that his conviction was based on perjured testimony. They challenged the federal government's authority to seek the death penalty in his case and argued that his advanced age made execution unconstitutional. As the years wore on, Moody became a symbol in legal circles, his case cited by both death penalty advocates and opponents. Supporters pointed to the heinousness of the crime. Opponents raised questions about age, the risk of wrongful conviction, and the meaning of justice after so much time had passed. The appeals process revealed the labyrinthine nature of capital punishment in America. Each level of review, state courts, federal courts, and the Supreme Court, examined different aspects of Moody's case. Some appeals focused on procedural issues, others on constitutional questions, and still others on new evidence or claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. By 2018, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was no longer the fiery, embittered man of his younger years. Now 83, he was frail, his hair white, his eyesight dimmed, his hands shaking with age. In his cell at Holman Correctional Facility, Moody waited as his execution date approached, knowing he was set to become the oldest person executed in the U.S. since the Supreme Court restored the death penalty in 1976. The weeks leading up to his execution were marked by intense legal activity. His lawyers filed emergency appeals seeking stays based on his age and health. Medical experts testified about his deteriorating condition, arguing that executing such an elderly, frail man would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. But the courts remained unmoved. On April 19, 2018, the process moved forward. The Supreme Court refused his final appeal. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey denied clemency. Prison staff prepared the execution chamber, following protocols to the letter. Outside, demonstrators gathered, some in support, some protesting the execution of an elderly man. The execution itself was carried out with the clinical precision that has become standard in modern capital punishment. Moody was transported from his cell to the execution chamber, where he was strapped to a gurney and prepared for lethal injection. The process was witnessed by family members of his victims, members of the media, and prison officials. Inside, witnesses included journalists, family members of Judge Vance, and officials. Moody was offered a final meal, but, according to official reports, he declined any special request and ate the standard prison fare that evening. Just after 8:30 p.m., Moody was led into the chamber. He declined to make a final statement, looking straight ahead. As the drugs were administered, he showed little emotion. The official time of death, 8:42 p.m. The execution of Walter Moody marked more than the end of a long legal odyssey. It reopened wounds for the families of Judge Vance and Robert Robinson, the communities shaken by the bombings, and those who spent years in the shadow of fear. For some, the execution brought a sense of closure. For others, it raised new questions. Many legal experts weighed in after the fact. Some pointed to the case as proof that even the most complex crimes can, eventually, be brought to justice. Others wondered about the wisdom of executing a man so old, so far removed from the acts that put him on death row in the first place. The case raised profound questions about the nature of justice and the purpose of punishment. After nearly 3 decades, was Moody's execution about justice for his victims, or was it simply the mechanical completion of a legal process that had taken on a life of its own? These questions don't have easy answers, and they continue to be debated in legal circles and among the general public. Moody's case is still cited in law schools and courtrooms across the country. It represents the extremes of the American justice system, the capacity for perseverance, the slow churn of appeals, and the ongoing debate about what true justice looks like after decades have passed. For the victims' families, the pain of loss remains. Helen Vance, who survived the bomb that killed her husband, spoke rarely to the media but expressed gratitude for the persistence of investigators and prosecutors who never gave up on the case. The Robinson family, too, found some measure of peace in knowing that their loved one's killer had finally been held accountable. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was not a household name before his crimes, but his actions and the system's response forced the nation to consider what justice means when time, age, and mortality itself enter the equation. His story is one of obsession turned deadly, of vengeance exacted not just on individuals, but on the very foundation of the courts. Whether you believe in the death penalty or oppose it, the execution of the oldest man on death row is a moment worth pausing over. It's a reminder that justice, however defined, is rarely swift, and that the scars left by violence stretch across generations. As we close this chapter, we remember those whose lives were taken, the families who waited for answers, and a legal system tested by one of its most relentless adversaries. If this story gave you something to consider, or if you want more fact-driven breakdowns of America's most challenging cases, consider subscribing. We strive to bring the truth without sensationalism and always with respect for the lives on all sides. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay aware, and we'll see you next time.